what if, what if the exact mathematical formulas that theoretical physicists use to predict the collapse of a star
Right.
could actually predict the exact moment your society just entirely collapses into totalitarianism?
It sounds wild.
It sounds completely made up. And what if the hidden hierarchy of your local grocery store, the biological stress you feel sitting in a corporate meeting, and global health statistics were all governed by literally the exact same evolutionary rules?
I mean, on the surface, yeah, it sounds like pure science fiction. But when you start applying the unforgiving hard math lens of physics to human behavior,
Hmm.
the boundaries between biology, politics, and sociology they completely dissolve.
Which is exactly why you, the listener, are about to embark on a really dense, paradigm-shifting intellectual journey with us today. We are doing a deep dive into an extensive, profound, and let's just say highly controversial conversation.
Highly controversial, for sure.
Yeah. It's from the YouTube channel The New World, or The New World. And it's a dialogue between Jonah Walk, who is a practicing physician, and Denis Rancourt.
Right. And Denis Rancourt is just a fascinating figure to anchor this entire framework around. He spent, I think, 23 years as a physics professor at the University of Ottawa.
Wow, 23 years.
Yeah, he's a serious interdisciplinary researcher. He's published peer-reviewed papers on everything from fundamental magnetism to, biogeochemistry, geopolitics, and even human mortality.
He's a guy who just looks at the world through raw data. And when a physicist turns that kind of cold, calculating lens onto medicine and state power, sparks fly.
Oh, absolutely.
And we need to make something explicitly clear right up front. This material dives into some intensely controversial views on COVID-19 protocols, vaccine mandates, climate change ideology, and the fundamental nature of government control.
Right.
As your guides on this deep dive, our job isn't to take a side. We're not telling you what to believe.
Exactly. We are entirely impartial here, neither left nor right.
Yep. Our mission is simply to map out the architecture of Rancourt's grand unified theory of society. We're just extracting the claims from the source material so you can evaluate these incredibly complex ideas for yourself.
Consider us your impartial tour guides through a very controversial intellectual museum. We're just pointing out the exhibits and reading the plaques.
So how does a theoretical physicist looking at face mass data end up formulating a unified theory about the evolutionary purpose of biological stress? Make that make sense to me.
Well, according to his account in the interview, Rancourt's journey really began in 2020. He went looking for the clinical literature on face masks.
Just to see if there was reliable evidence of a benefit for the general population, right?
Exactly. And he concluded that the unambiguous science showed no reliable evidence of benefit. So he wrote a scientific review article stating exactly that, published it on the platform ResearchGate,
I'm the
is subsequently barred from the site.
Wow, just barred completely.
Yeah.
Yep. And that censorship seemed to act as a massive pivot point for him. It pushed him away from trusting any institutional consensus and directly toward the rawest, hardest numbers he could find.
Because he became completely disillusioned with the epidemiological predictive models being used to justify societal lockdowns.
No, he abandoned the models entirely.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because people hear the phrase predictive models and they just assume it's pure objective science.
Right, they think it's a crystal ball.
Yeah. But a model is really just a sophisticated guess based on assumptions. You plug in an assumed transmission rate, an assumed fatality rate, an assumed level of social mixing, and the computer spits out a terrifying curve.
The assumptions are the Achilles heel of any model. I mean, if you assume a pathogen spreads uniformly based on proximity, like a gas filling a room, the model will predict catastrophic spread in a crowded subway system.
Right.
But if that assumption ignores complex biological realities like pre-existing cross-immunity or seasonal viral interference, the model's output will be entirely at odds with reality. So Rancourt, being an expert in statistics, decided to just throw the predictive models in the trash.
Pretty much. He shifted his focus to the hardest, most indisputable data available on the planet.
All-cause mortality.
Yes, all-cause mortality.
We really need to explain why all-cause mortality is the absolute gold standard for a physicist trying to understand a global event. Because, I mean, on the surface, it sounds like a really dry statistical term.
It does, but the beauty of all-cause mortality is that it completely removes human bias. It removes diagnostic error. It removes political pressure.
Because think about how a specific cause of death is usually recorded. It relies on diagnostic tests, which, have known rates of false positives or false negatives.
Exactly. It relies on the subjective judgment of a medical professional who might be overwhelmed or operating under hastily written new guidelines.
Or even hospital administrative policies that incentivize coding deaths a certain way for funding. There's always a narrative attached. This person died of X or with Y.
Right. But all-cause mortality strips away the narrative entirely. It asks a purely binary biological question. Is this person dead or are they alive?
That's it.
You know the exact date they died, their age, and their geographic location. There is no guessing. Governments in the developed world have been legally required to tabulate this specific data in the exact same way for over a century. It's just the raw output of human life ending.
It's like looking at all-cause mortality is like monitoring the total power draw on a city's electrical grid, rather than trusting the self-reported energy bills of individual households.
So that's a great analogy.
Right. You stop looking at the stories people tell about their electricity use, you ignore the faulty meters in their living rooms, and you just look at the raw output at the power plant. The grid doesn't lie.
The grid does not lie. And when Rancourt looked at the total power grid, when he analyzed the all-cause mortality data across over 100 countries in high temporal resolution, he made a deeply controversial finding.
What did he find?
He claims that his analysis showed absolutely no detectable mortality spike anywhere in the world until the exact date the pandemic was officially announced by global health authorities.
Wait, really?
Yeah. He describes it as a synchronous peak that perfectly aligns with the announcement and the subsequent aggressive institutional response. But what's even more striking is the geographic distribution. He argues that the virus seemingly had a passport.
A passport? What does that mean?
Well, he observed massive, concentrated spikes in mortality in specific jurisdictions that implemented highly aggressive medical protocols and immediate societal lockdowns, places like New York or northern Italy, or certain countries bordering Germany.
Okay.
But in neighboring jurisdictions that did not implement those exact same aggressive protocols, like Germany itself at the time, there was zero detectable mortality spike.
Okay, hold on. I have to push back here. You're telling me a respiratory pathogen hit an invisible political line in the dirt between two countries and just stopped?
Right, it sounds crazy.
That defies basic biology. An airborne virus doesn't stop at a border patrol checkpoint. How does Rancourt explain away the mechanics of viral transmission?
That is the crucial distinction he makes. He isn't saying the virus stopped at the border. He assumes the virus spread everywhere, as respiratory viruses naturally do.
Oh, okay.
What he is saying is that the mortality spike stopped at the border. If the virus was present in both country A and country B, but massive excess death only occurred in country A, then the virus itself cannot be the primary independent driver of the mortality.
Okay, I see. If the pathogen is a constant, but the death rate varies wildly based on political boundaries,
Yeah.
you have to look at the variable.
Exactly. And the variable is the government response, which leads him to an incredibly heavy conclusion. He attributes roughly 31 million excess deaths globally over 3 years, not primarily to a spreading viral pathogen, but to the aggressive institutional response and inappropriate medical protocols.
Wow. Let that sink in. This is where the dynamic between the two speakers in our source material becomes so illuminating. You have Jonah Walk, the physician, whose entire training is micro-focused. She looks at one patient at a time.
Right, the clinical approach.
Yeah, she sees a patient with respiratory distress, matches a CT scan to a specific disease profile, and prescribes a targeted treatment based on institutional guidelines.
The clinical approach is about diagnosing the tree, not the forest. But Rancourt, the physicist, is mapping the entire forest from a satellite.
Exactly.
And Walk actually admits in the interview that looking at the all-cause mortality data forced her to reconsider her foundational assumptions. When you step back from the individual diagnosis, you begin to see massive systemic stressors that a one-by-one clinical approach completely misses.
It makes sense. If a doctor sees 100 people come in with broken legs, they treat 100 broken legs. They might never step outside the emergency room to realize the city just installed a new, incredibly slippery sidewalk downtown.
Rancourt is studying the sidewalk. He acknowledges that infections are real, of course. He mentions phenomena like aspiration pneumonia, which can be exacerbated by forced mechanical ventilation and dangerous changes to the human microbiome caused by isolation and over-sanitization.
Right.
But his core argument is that something else created the initial vulnerability. If a spreading virus wasn't the primary driver of this massive mortality event, what actually killed these millions of fragile individuals?
And Rancourt's answer to that question takes us on a hard left turn out of public health statistics and plunges us deep into the waters of evolutionary biology. He points the finger directly at biological stress.
Yes.
And we aren't talking about the colloquial idea of being a little stressed out because you have a deadline at work, right?
Mhm.
We're talking about biological stress as a profound physical mechanism of control.
Exactly. The medical and societal response, the sudden lockdowns, the strict mandates, the constant media messaging induced severe biological panic. Think about the physiological reality of profound social isolation, acute fear of a supposed invisible enemy, immobilization in your home, and the sudden severing of normal physical human contact.
It's devastating to the body.
Scientifically, it is a proven fact that prolonged biological stress in fragile populations destroys the immune system. It spikes cortisol levels, which degrades tissue, alters the gut microbiome, and leaves the body completely defenseless against normally benign bacterial or viral loads.
But Rancourt doesn't just stop at stress lowers your immune system. I mean, that would be too simple. He takes this biological reality and plugs it into a grand theory of social organization.
He invites us to perform a thought experiment. Imagine an extraterrestrial team of scientists coming down to study Earth.
Okay, aliens with clipboards. I like it.
Right. The very first macro-level observation this alien team would make about social animals, whether they are studying a hive of bees, a troop of macaques, or a bustling human city, is that the moment these animals organize into a society for evolutionary advantage, they instantly structure themselves into a dominance hierarchy.
A pyramid. You have dominant individuals, institutions, or elites at the very top, and a massive ladder of underlings beneath them.
And how is that hierarchy maintained across all social species?
Ouch.
It doesn't maintain itself peacefully. It is maintained by constant downward aggression from the top toward the bottom.
To keep people or animals in their place, there must be a persistent exertion of force.
Yes. And Rancourt specifies that for this downward pressure to be truly impactful and terrifying, it often takes forms that seem chaotic, arbitrary, or completely irrational to the underlings.
Like a boss changing the rules of the office seemingly at random. Or, a government imposing contradictory health mandates that don't logically align with the data. The irrationality isn't a mistake, it's a feature. It keeps you off balance.
Which brings us to his radical hypothesis. Rancourt proposes that the link between biological stress and poor health isn't a glitch in our mammalian operating system. It is a highly conserved evolutionary advantage designed specifically to stabilize the dominance hierarchy.
Let that sink in for a second. He is arguing that the physical weakness and illness caused by the stress of being aggressed upon is evolutionarily hardwired into us.
Yes.
Why? To keep the underlings weak. If the stress of being at the bottom of the pyramid, the financial anxiety, the fear of authority, the social isolation, physically degrades your body, it naturally prevents you from acquiring the muscular strength and cognitive energy required to violently challenge and overthrow the dominant elites.
It keeps the pyramid intact.
Okay, let's unpack this,
Yeah.
because my mind is reeling a bit. If we are biologically hardwired to be weakened by the dominance hierarchy so that society remains perfectly stable, if we are literally meant to just get sick and accept our place at the bottom for the greater good of the structure, why do we have this innate visceral drive to fight back?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because everything in me, when faced with unfairness or heavy-handed oppression, wants to rebel. I want to demand fairness and tear down the unjust hierarchy. If evolution wants me quiet and weak, why did it give me the spirit of a rebel?
That tension is exactly what Jonah Walk brings up in the conversation. And Rancourt's synthesis here is genuinely brilliant. He explains that your very urge to rebel is the essential biological counterforce required to keep the species alive.
How does that work?
Well, a dominance hierarchy has a life of its own. It is a mathematical engine of extraction. If left completely unchecked, the elites at the top will always veer toward the extreme, pulling more and more resources upward until they create a totally totalitarian state.
An extreme pyramid. A handful of hyper-wealthy overlords at the peak and a massive base of starving, exploited serfs at the bottom.
But here's the evolutionary catch. A society comprised entirely of sick, beaten-down serfs is incredibly weak on a macro scale.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Serfs make terrible soldiers. They lack the cognitive surplus to invent new technologies or adapt to changing environments. If a dominance hierarchy pushes its underlings too far, crushing them with biological stress, the entire society becomes vulnerable. They will inevitably be wiped out by an outside competitor, a neighboring tribe, or a rival nation that has a healthier, more robust population.
Ah, so the rebel is biologically necessary to prevent the dominance hierarchy from destroying the society's overall competitive
That's
edge.
exactly.
The pushback from the individual, the demand for fair wages, for bodily autonomy, for resources, is the friction that stops the hierarchy from spinning out of control into a totalitarian death spiral.
The conflict between the downward aggression of the hierarchy and the upward push of the individual rebel is the engine that keeps a society strong, adaptable, and properly stratified. It's a violent, continuous evolutionary balancing act.
So we have this downward aggression constantly pushing on us, utilizing biological stress to keep us in our place. But how does this actually manifest in our modern daily lives? I mean, we aren't macaques physically biting each other over a piece of fruit.
Right.
The aggression in human society has to be more sophisticated than just the threat of physical violence from police or the military.
It is vastly more sophisticated, and it manifests in a deeply insidious, everyday way. It manifests through the literal fuel we put into our bodies.
Food.
Food. In any dominance hierarchy, access to resources operates on a gradient. And in human society, this gradient is starkly, undeniably visible in our nutrition.
Rancourt explains that at the top of the hierarchy, the dominant individuals have access to the most nutrient-dense foods. Biologically speaking, for omnivores and carnivores like humans, that means high-quality animal proteins, rich fats, organs, the foods that provide complex, dense nutritional value that built our large brains over millions of years.
And what happens to the underlings at the bottom of the hierarchy? They are left with low-nutrition, high-calorie substitutes. Rancourt looks at the modern obesity epidemic, particularly in places like the United States, and he doesn't see a failure of individual willpower. He doesn't see a population that suddenly became lazy.
What does he see?
He sees a direct engineered manifestation of the dominance hierarchy.
He argues that megacorporations essentially mass-produce highly toxic, low-nutrition foods loaded with refined sugars, seed oils, and fake fats. And these foods are quite literally designed in laboratories to fool human biology.
Yes. Our bodies naturally crave salt and fat because historically, those tastes signaled the rare presence of life-sustaining meat and dense calories.
The food industry hijacks that ancient biological drive. They provide the hyper-palatable taste without the accompanying nutrition. The body tastes the salt and fat, expects a surge of complex vitamins and amino acids, receives nothing but empty carbohydrates, and so it stays hungry. It demands you eat more.
But it goes even deeper than just processed junk food. Rancourt dives into the agricultural methods themselves. Modern agri-food methods, particularly massive monocrop farming, fundamentally deplete the soil.
So even if an underling is trying to eat healthy, even if they're buying plant-based foods from the produce section, those vegetables lack the complex nutrients they contained a century ago.
Rancourt makes a crucial biological distinction here between plant and animal foods regarding this soil depletion. An animal, a cow or a sheep, acts as a biological nutrient extractor.
How so?
Even if a cow is grazing on less than ideal nutrient-poor grass, its complex digestive system and biology work over years to extract and condense whatever trace minerals and vitamins are available, storing them in its muscle and liver.
So the animal does the heavy lifting of gathering the scattered nutrients.
Exactly. Plants, however, do not have that luxury. A stalk of corn or a head of lettuce only has a few weeks to draw whatever is immediately available in the degraded topsoil it is planted in. If the soil is poor, the plant is poor. There is no biological condensation process.
There's an illustrative anecdote in the source material that perfectly captures this primal, almost inescapable pull of nutrition. Jonah Walk mentions a friend who studied the demographics of China and noted that the massive urbanization of pre-1990s China was heavily driven by a very specific, seemingly minor government policy.
Right, the fish policy.
The policy guaranteed city dwellers 1 fish per week.
Just one fish.
Think about the magnitude of that. The biological draw of high-quality animal protein, the promise of essential fatty acids and complex nutrients, was so powerful that it functioned as a primary engine for moving millions of human beings from the countryside into dense urban centers.
It's credible.
It perfectly illustrates how foundational nutrient access is to human behavior and societal engineering.
And it highlights a massive, arguably intentional disconnect in how modern Western governments approach public health. Governments frequently implement policies pushing heavy grain consumption, taxing natural fats, or instituting sugar taxes to ostensibly help the lower classes make better choices.
Right, it's always framed as a moral imperative. The poor are eating poorly and burdening the healthcare system. We need to penalize their bad choices for their own good.
But Rancourt argues this completely misunderstands the biological reality of the hierarchy. When the wealthy elite adopt extreme healthy eating rules, maybe they go on a strict raw vegan diet or they only consume hyper-expensive imported organic grains, it makes very little biological difference to their overall health span.
Why is that?
Because they are already living in a state of massive nutritional surplus. Their baseline of security, low stress, and environmental quality compensates for any dietary fats.
It's performative nutrition. It signals their status precisely because it is difficult and expensive to maintain.
Meanwhile, the poor are trapped. They are biologically starving for nutrients. They're only provided with cheap, engineered addictive substitutes in their local food deserts, and then the government steps in and financially penalizes them for succumbing to the very addictions the corporate system engineered in the first place.
This creates a devastating feedback loop. When an underling is nutrient deficient, their physiology is fundamentally compromised. Their cells literally lack the building blocks to repair tissue.
All right.
Therefore, they are physically less capable of handling the severe biological stress we discussed earlier.
Poor nutrition destroys the body's resilience. That weakened body is then subjected to the intense biological stress of downward aggression from the hierarchy, financial insecurity, grueling shift work, lack of sleep, heavy-handed policing, and social marginalization.
The systemic stress and the poor nutrition work in perfect tandem.
They do. They physically lock the underling at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy.
It's a biological prison. You are too stressed to digest properly and too malnourished to fight back against the stress.
So we have built a massive framework so far. We have the raw data of all-cause mortality pointing to systemic stress rather than just a viral pathogen. We have the evolutionary biology of the dominance hierarchy using that stress, combined with nutritional deprivation, to weaken the lower classes and maintain stability.
But Rancourt is a former physicist. He couldn't just leave this at biology and sociology. Biology explains the mechanism, but physics explains the threshold. He needed math.
He needed the numbers.
And here's where it gets really interesting. He points to a literal, theoretical, mathematical model that explains exactly how this hierarchy operates and, more importantly, exactly when it catastrophically snaps.
This is one of the most intellectually thrilling parts of the entire discussion. Rancourt brings up a pivotal theoretical physics paper published by a researcher named Joseph Hickey.
Okay.
Hickey, along with his PhD supervisor, attempted to model the structure of human society using the absolute simplest parameters possible, based entirely on individual micro-level interactions.
Because what is a society, really? It isn't just a blob. It is millions of micro-interactions happening constantly. Every time you argue with a customer service representative, every time you ask your boss for a raise, every time you dispute a parking ticket in court, there's a conflict.
And in every single one of those conflicts, there is an assertion of status. You are either put in your place, reinforcing the hierarchy, or you manage to acquire a tiny bit more status and push upward. To model this mathematically, the Hickey model requires only 2 parameters to predict the stability of an entire society.
Okay, let's break down these variables. What is the first one?
The first variable is the authoritarian parameter. This asks a simple statistical question. If you are of a lower social status and you come into conflict with someone or something of a higher status, say a corporate landlord or a bureaucratic agency, what is your actual mathematical probability of winning that conflict and gaining an advantage?
If your chance of winning is absolute 0, if the landlord can evict you without due process or the agency can freeze your bank account with no oversight, you live in a highly authoritarian system.
Exactly.
If you have a decent statistical chance of winning by hiring a lawyer, making a good argument, or appealing to a fair judge, the system is less authoritarian.
The second variable is the violence parameter. This measures the cost of losing. When you inevitably lose a conflict with a higher status entity, how severe is the punishment?
Do you just get a slap on the wrist and a small fine? Or do you lose your medical license, your career, your savings, and your social standing? How many rungs down the ladder do you violently fall when you lose?
Think of the Hickey model like a massive audio mixing board for an entire nation. You have these 2 main faders, the authoritarian fader and the violence
I
fader.
love this visual.
What the physics model demonstrates through rigorous statistical mechanics is that as long as these two faders stay within certain mathematical bounds, the music keeps playing smoothly. You get a stable, relatively fair, properly stratified democracy.
But the math reveals a terrifying reality about what happens when you push those faders too high.
Mm.
The society doesn't just slowly degrade. It doesn't gracefully slide into inequality.
Mm.
It collapses exponentially,
It undergoes what physicists call a phase transition.
like water turning to ice. As you cool water down, it remains a liquid. It might get colder, but it's still water.
Mm.
But the second it hits 0 degrees Celsius, the molecules don't slowly get slushy over weeks.
No, they snap.
They instantly snap into a rigid crystalline structure. The fundamental state of the matter changes.
That is exactly what the Hickey model predicts for human society. The moment the combined forces of authoritarianism and violence cross a specific mathematical threshold, the society instantly plummets into an extreme totalitarian state.
Wow.
The middle class evaporates overnight. You are left with hyper-wealthy, untouchable elites at the absolute peak and a vast ocean of utterly powerless, biologically sick serfs at the bottom.
And we connect this to the bigger picture of statecraft.
Yep.
This mathematical model explains the fundamental job of a functional government. A functioning state is constantly monitoring and adjusting those faders on the mixing board.
Laws, policies, Supreme Court rulings, antitrust legislation, these are the state's hands on the mixing board.
Right. If a new technology, like artificial intelligence or an outside threat, changes the economic environment, a healthy state adjusts the laws. It might increase taxes on monopolies or strengthen labor unions to ensure the authoritarian and violence parameters don't cross the threshold into collapse.
A good government actively manages fairness not necessarily out of the goodness of its heart, but because it recognizes that an extreme pyramid is inherently unstable.
The source material actually cites China as a fascinating modern example of this. Rancourt argues that the Chinese leadership recognized the profound destabilizing threat of extreme localized poverty and rampant bureaucratic corruption.
Because a corrupt local official operating with impunity pushes the authoritarian fader to maximum.
Exactly. So the central government aggressively targeted corruption and instituted massive infrastructure projects to pull millions out of poverty, deliberately keeping those societal parameters in the safe zone to maintain national strengths and cohesion.
Because a nation of starving serfs is weak and vulnerable to foreign influence. A nation with a healthy, resource-secure middle and lower class is powerful. But what happens when the hands on the mixing board don't care about the music? What happens when parasitic elites hijack the board?
That is the ultimate danger of parallel hierarchies. Massive global corporations, international financial institutions, or deeply entrenched, corrupt political dynasties operate as their own dominance hierarchies within the host state.
They don't care about the long-term stability of the nation. They only care about extracting wealth and power for themselves in the short term.
And in doing so, they push the faders of authoritarianism and violence higher and higher.
Right. They lobby to deregulate their industries, meaning underlings have zero chance of winning conflicts. They privatize essential resources, increasing the violence of losing your job. They exploit the underlings mercilessly, driving the entire mathematical system toward the exponential breaking point.
They push the faders so high they blow out the speakers and the whole system crashes. And if we look at the Western world right now, through the lens of the Hickey model, it certainly feels like those faders are pushing deep into the red zone.
It really does.
The cost of losing a conflict today, losing your livelihood over a social media post, being priced out of housing forever because of an unexpected medical bill, it feels incredibly violent in a social and economic sense.
It does, which raises an incredibly important question. As a system mathematically approaches that breaking point, as the economic exploitation increases and the biological stress mounts, how do the elites maintain control of a population that is increasingly desperate? If the faders are in the red zone, why doesn't the population revolt immediately?
Physical force is expensive. Deploying the military or expanding police forces costs billions of dollars and provides a highly visible target for the underlings to rally against. The most efficient way to maintain control as the system strains is through the strategic top-down use of ideology.
Rancourt traces the modern application of this strategy back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Following the Cold War, a massive new era of unipolar globalization emerged. And to facilitate this globalization, to easily manage, integrate, and manipulate vast, disparate populations across different cultures and legal systems, Generic ideologies were strategically seeded into Western institutions.
He describes these ideologies almost like a mental operating system installed in the public.
It is a profound analogy. He specifically points to sweeping, globalized ideological frameworks around catastrophic climate change, pervasive anti-racism initiatives, and the intense policing of toxic language or widespread censorship under the guise of safety.
Now remember our commitment to impartiality here. We are not debating the underlying meteorological realities of climate science, nor are we dismissing the historical realities of racial injustice.
Absolutely not.
We are examining Rancourt's structural argument about how these broad concepts are weaponized by institutional power.
The underlying truth of the concept is almost irrelevant to the hierarchy. Rancourt's argument is that these ideologies are propagated top-down through universities, media, and corporate HR departments specifically to bypass critical thinking. They are elevated to the status of unquestionable dogma.
If you question the implementation of the policy, you are immediately branded as a heretic, a denier, a bigot, a danger to public safety.
And their primary function is to secure cheap, frictionless compliance. If the population deeply internalizes the ideology, they will willingly participate in the elite agenda without needing to be physically forced.
They police themselves.
They police their neighbors. They gladly accept a lower standard of living, eating less meat, owning fewer things, accepting massive inflation because they believe they are doing it for the righteous cause the ideology has outlined.
It's brilliant, in a dark way. You don't need to push the violence fader if the population willingly turns down their own resources. But the key tell, according to Rancourt, is how utterly disposable these deeply held ideologies are to the state apparatus itself.
Oh, exactly. When an ideology no longer serves the national interest or the elite economic agenda, the state will simply shift gears and discard it without a second thought.
Give me an example.
The prime example he gives is the United States eventually withdrawing from the 1992 Kyoto Protocol climate treaty. For years, the ideology of global emission reduction was paramount. But when the economic calculus shifted and complying with the treaty threatened American industrial dominance, the states simply walked away, proving that the ideology is merely a tool of power, not a foundational, immutable truth of the dominance hierarchy.
So let's look at the board. You have parallel hierarchies of global corporations competing with nation-states. You have elites recklessly manipulating the faders of violence and authoritarianism to extract wealth. You have populations being pacified and distracted by generic, top-down ideologies. It paints a picture of a world in profound structural turmoil.
We are undoubtedly living a mosaic of global upheaval. But stepping back into the macro view, history shows us that this upheaval is entirely cyclical. This is not the first time humanity has approached the breaking point of the Hickey model.
Right. Jonah Walk asks Rancourt about the historical context of massive mortality events during these periods of societal strain. Does history support the math?
It does. Rancourt points directly to the Black Death. The popular narrative is that the bubonic plague was an equal opportunity killer, a totally random act of biological devastation that just swept blindly across Europe, killing kings and peasants alike.
But Rancourt points to modern anthropological data that tells a very different story. Researchers have studied the bones and teeth of plague victims from mass graves. And what do the teeth show?
What do they show?
They show deep lines of nutritional stress and chronic infection that predated the plague. The Black Death disproportionately slaughtered the poor, the malnourished, the overexploited serfs, whose bodies were already broken by the extreme, extractive dominance hierarchy of feudalism.
The biological stress and the severe nutritional deficits we detailed earlier basically prepped the population for devastation. The plague was just the spark hitting a massive pile of dry, stressed kindling.
Extreme oppression pushes the system to a physical breaking point, a massive epidemic or widespread starvation. The math of the Hickey model breaks. This tragedy forces a societal reset. The old corrupt hierarchy simply collapses under the weight of its own greedy exploitation because the base of the pyramid dies off. And what follows that devastating reset?
The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, periods of incredible rebirth, flatter social structures, fairer wages for the surviving laborers, and explosive scientific advancement.
Because the faders on the mixing board have been violently forced back down to the stable, fair middle ground. The cycle begins again.
But I have to ask a grounding question here on behalf of the listener. When you are just a regular person, trying to pay your rent, navigating a tough job market, trying to buy groceries that keep getting more expensive, how do you even begin to process the fact that you might be living through a macro-historical cycle of collapse and reset? It feels so big, so abstract, and honestly paralyzing.
It is overwhelming. To bring it down to earth, Rancourt points to a very specific current geopolitical event to ground this theory: the massive ongoing protests by European farmers.
He calls the farmers the canary in the coal mine for the middle class.
Think about the modern elite. The people truly at the top of the dominance hierarchy are highly globalized. They don't live in your town, they fly over your town. They live and operate entirely above the nation-state level. They are physically, culturally, and economically detached from the traditional working and middle classes.
And from their perspective at the peak of the global pyramid, an independent, entitled, traditional middle-class people who own their own land, produce their own goods, and expect a high standard of living and political representation, that group is a direct existential threat to their total control.
Because independent food producers control the foundational resource. If you control the calories, you have leverage.
By aggressively regulating, taxing, and ultimately destroying independent food production under the guise of various environmental ideologies, the highly globalized elites consolidate power. They replace independent, resilient farmers with massive, easily controlled corporate agribusiness. This deliberately increases the dependency of the underlings.
Makes perfect sense.
Recognizing this geopolitical reality, seeing the farmer protests not merely as a local dispute over tractor fuel subsidies, but as a literal clash of parallel hierarchies fighting over the violence and authoritarian faders, is the first step to surviving the crunch.
So, if the system is mathematically pushing toward an exponential collapse, and generic ideologies are constantly beamed into our phones to keep us compliant, what is the actual mechanism for fighting back? How do you become the evolutionary rebel that saves society from totalitarianism? It all starts with how we are taught to think, which brings us to the final piece of Rancourt's framework: true education and the art of resistance.
This brings the conversation full circle back to Rancourt's personal story. Remember, he was a highly respected, tenured professor for 23 years, but he was ultimately fired. And he states very clearly that he was fired because he refused to participate in what he calls the lie of modern academia.
He argues that modern universities, and by extension the massive corporate bureaucracies, medical systems, and government agencies they feed their graduates into, do not actually care about education.
Yeah.
They require complete indoctrination and absolute obedience. In his view, the tenure system itself isn't a protector of free speech. It is a final, golden handcuff, guaranteeing that by the time you achieve it, you have been so thoroughly filtered for compliance that you will never truly oppose the system.
The lie of education, as he defines it, is the dangerous idea that simply delivering a curriculum is synonymous with a student actually learning. You sit in a comfortable chair, I project a PowerPoint at you for an hour, you memorize the bullet points, you pass the multiple choice test, and therefore you are educated.
But true learning, especially of complex universal concepts, doesn't work like that at all. Rancourt uses the brilliant example of teaching Newton's laws of motion to incoming physics students.
Newton's laws are actually deeply counterintuitive to a primate just walking around on Earth. We experience friction constantly. If we stop pushing a rock, it stops moving. So our instinctual brain assumes force is required to maintain velocity.
Right, that's just common sense.
Exactly. But to truly learn and internalize Newton's first law, that an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by a force, a student cannot just memorize the equation. They have to actively unlearn their deeply held instinctual mammalian notions about how the physical world operates.
And unlearning requires immense friction. It requires personal challenge, rigorous, heated interaction with the professor, and the deep psychological discomfort of realizing your fundamental worldview was wrong.
But modern education has been ruthlessly streamlined to eliminate all friction. Institutions want to avoid hurt feelings, they want smooth, quantifiable metrics, and they demand high graduation rates to justify exorbitant tuition costs.
So they just pass everyone along.
By removing the friction of genuine debate, Rancourt argues, universities are no longer creating independent, resilient thinkers. They are merely churning out obedient, credentialed employees who are perfectly primed to quietly enter the lower rungs of the dominance hierarchy and do exactly what they are told.
They are teaching compliance, not comprehension. They are building perfect, frictionless cogs. So if the entire education system is designed from the ground up to pacify us, how do we actually resist? How do we push the faders back down? The source is very clear about what doesn't work.
Yes, Rancourt issues a stark warning against the romanticized Hollywood idea of a violent revolution. If you resort to violence, if you take up arms or riot, you are stepping into the one arena where the modern state has an absolute, overwhelming, and technologically supreme monopoly.
You can't outgun the state.
No. A violent uprising doesn't reset the hierarchy. It only provides the perfect justification for extreme, crushing military and police repression. It gives the elite the excuse to push the violence fader on the Hickey model all the way to maximum instantly.
Okay, so a violent revolution is a trap.
Yeah.
What about peaceful protests? What about grabbing a clever sign, marching outside a government building for a few hours on a Saturday, and posting it on social media?
He is equally, if not more, critical of that approach. He argues that holding a sign at a permitted peaceful protest is virtually meaningless unless it is merely the public reflection of actual, everyday, structural disobedience.
Right.
The elite at the top of the pyramid do not care if you stand in the street and chant for an afternoon, if you go right back to your cubicle and comply with every single mandate, unjust rule, and corporate directive the very next morning. It's performative resistance. It relieves the pressure valve without changing the machine.
The system only reacts when its power to extract resources and command obedience is actually challenged in practice. And historically, people only find the immense courage required to do this when their core biology is threatened.
Exactly.
When their bodily integrity is intimately violated, like through forced medical interventions, or when their access to basic survival-level resources is severed, like losing a job or a farm. That is the threshold where the biological switch finally flips from accept the stress and weaken to stand up, refuse to comply, and fight.
But Jonah Walk asks a highly practical, grounding question here. She points out that Rancourt describes his own approach as going into academic arguments like a bull in a china shop. He got fired for his principles.
Right, you paid the price.
Is it realistic or even morally responsible to ask the average listener who has a mortgage, a car payment, and children to become a bull in a china shop, to risk getting fired and losing their health insurance just to prove a philosophical point against the dominance hierarchy?
Rancourt provides a surprisingly nuanced, tactical answer to this. He is speaking directly to the academics, doctors, and corporate professionals who clearly see the flaws in the system but are terrified to speak up. He says you don't have to get fired tomorrow.
You don't have to throw yourself onto the gears of the machine immediately and destroy your life.
No, but you can, and you absolutely must, rebel strategically. You can refuse to blindly follow administrative orders that you know are scientifically wrong or morally harmful. You can be the person in the bureaucratic committee meeting who politely but firmly asks the deeply uncomfortable question that everyone else is desperately avoiding.
You can refuse to use the generic ideology's terminology. You can actively seek out contrarian viewpoints to challenge your own institutional dogma. Rancourt argues that doing this, finding your inner rebel in the small daily professional interactions, is vital not just for society, but for your own soul and your moral development.
Because if you don't,
If you just keep your head down, follow orders, and pretend you are being a good person simply by being obedient, you are, in his exact words, marching toward your own spiritual and intellectual death.
and if we zoom all the way back out to the physics of society, to the Hickey model, those small calculated acts of daily resistance are the key. Asking the hard question, refusing to comply with a petty, unjust corporate rule, supporting an independent farmer that distributed. Everyday friction is exactly how the population collectively grabs the authoritarian fader and physically forces it back down. That friction is the only thing that prevents the exponential collapse into totalitarianism.
So let's bring this immense journey all together. We started with the raw, unemotional, binary data of all-cause mortality during a global health crisis, stripping away the diagnostic narratives to see the true impact of institutional policy.
Which opened a massive trapdoor into the evolutionary biology of stress, revealing how downward irrational aggression from elites physically weakens the underclass to maintain the stability of the social pyramid.
We examine the nutritional gradient, exploring how the processed food we are sold and the depleted soil it grows in are structurally engineered to keep the lower classes biologically starving and locked in place.
We dove into the literal physics of societal collapse through the Hickey model, seeing how the delicate mathematical balance of authoritarianism and violence dictates whether a nation thrives as a democracy or snaps into an extreme totalitarian state.
We explored how generic, globalized ideologies are deployed top-down as a mental operating system to bypass our critical thinking and secure our willing compliance, while parallel hierarchies consolidate power.
And finally, we discussed the desperate need to radically reform how we educate ourselves, emphasizing that true learning requires the painful friction of unlearning. And true resistance requires everyday strategic disobedience rather than just performative protests.
And again, we must remind you, we are laying out Denis Rancourt's unified theory here. We are acting entirely impartially, taking no political sides, but merely offering you this architectural framework as a tool to evaluate the world.
Because once you understand the mechanics of this framework, you possess a completely different lens through which to view reality. The next time you walk into a massive corporate grocery store and see the endless aisles of brightly colored, highly processed sugars, the next time you have a deeply frustrating, seemingly irrational interaction with a faceless health bureaucracy, or the next time you read a global news headline demanding you adopt a new, sweeping ideology for the greater good, you aren't just a passive observer anymore.
You can see the actual gears of the dominance hierarchy turning. You understand the math and the biology behind the aggression.
You are an active participant in adjusting the parameters of society. You are the biological, evolutionary counterforce. We want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to explore on your own that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
The source discussed how historical plagues, like the Black Death, triggered massive societal resets by disproportionately affecting the physically stressed and malnourished underclass. The breaking point in the past was fiercely biological and physical.
But today, we live in a completely unprecedented era. Biological stress can now be generated not just by physical police enforcement or literal starvation, but instantly, globally, through our hyper-connected digital landscape. Think about it.
It's everywhere.
If the dominance hierarchy now operates heavily through digital algorithms, through the viral intentional spread of panic, outrage, and social isolation directly into our nervous systems via our smartphones, rather than just physical force, will the next great historical reset be fought and won entirely in the realm of human attention?
We've stepped completely out of the clean binary world of the X-ray machine.
We are swimming in the murky, fascinating waters now. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.